I met Ryan through my best friend from high school, Steve. They had grown up together, and Ryan always gave off a bad boy vibe, with a sly expression and a smile that made people uneasy. One day after school, Steve mysteriously said to me, "We're going to the secret base. Want to come?" Ryan stood nearby, hands in his pockets, a faint smirk on his lips as he taunted, "Are you brave enough?" His tone carried a chilling disdain. Annoyed, I agreed to join them. The secret base was located behind the school, in a forgotten area. It wasn't much of a mountain, just a small, densely wooded hill. The trees were unusually thick, their intertwined branches blocking out most of the sunlight. Few people ever came here. The air was damp and carried a foul, rotting smell, and the ground was soft and muddy. We followed a narrow path deeper into the woods. Eventually, we reached a clearing. It was a small, enclosed space, surrounded by trees that formed a natural cage, isolating it from the outside world. The ground was overgrown with weeds, but what caught my attention were the uneven mounds of dirt scattered around. Ryan walked into the bushes and returned carrying a rusty iron cage. Inside was a thin, frail white rabbit. Its eyes were lifeless, staring ahead, and its body trembled slightly, as if it had already given up on struggling. Ryan pulled the rabbit out, and it hung limply in his hands like a ragdoll, completely lifeless. "Let's begin," Ryan said excitedly. Steve chuckled and pulled a dagger from Ryan's backpack, handing it to him. My heart tightened, and I instinctively took a step back. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ryan didn't answer. He pinned the rabbit to the ground, raised the dagger, and without hesitation, stabbed it. The rabbit's body twitched violently, letting out a weak whimper. I screamed, begging him to stop, but Ryan just gave me a cold look, his eyes filled with disdain and cruelty. "You're so noisy," he muttered. He raised the dagger again, and stabbed the rabbit once more. This time, the rabbit struggled for a few moments before going still. Ryan stood up, kicking the rabbit's corpse with his foot. Steve walked over to me, and whispered, "We're just testing if it's really dead." His calm tone sent chills down my spine, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I stared at him, filled with fear and confusion. How could he be so composed? Ryan picked up a shovel and ordered me to dig a hole. I refused, frozen by fear. Steve took the shovel and started digging nearby. Ryan glared at me and said, "Don't come back here again." As I looked at the mounds of dirt, I suddenly realized this wasn't their first time doing something like this. Ryan kicked the rabbit's body into the hole, then made a gesture of prayer, muttering, "May it rest in peace." I was furious, but my feet felt nailed to the ground. I wanted to stop them, to yell at them for their cruelty, but my throat felt blocked, and no sound came out. On the way down the hill, Ryan waved the blood-stained dagger, while laughing with Steve. I walked behind them, feeling nauseous and terrified. From that day on, I stopped hanging out with them, and they didn't seem to care. A year later, Ryan died. His death caused a huge uproar because of how bizarre it was. Ryan's parents had gone out of state for work, leaving him alone at home for 2 days. When they returned, they found him dead in his bed. His stomach had been torn open. His intestines spilled out onto the floor. The room was covered in footprints, but not human footprints. There were prints of dogs, cats, rabbits, and even birds. Ryan's body was covered in scratches and bite marks, his face twisted into a grotesque expression of agony, as if he had experienced unimaginable terror before dying. The fatal wound was the gaping hole in his stomach, but it wasn't cut open by a knife. It looked like it had been torn apart by some kind of wild animal. His body had been partially eaten, exposing white bone. The police attributed his death to an animal attack, but no one could explain why animals would break into his room and kill him in such a brutal way. Ryan's death hit Steve hard. He became withdrawn and stopped going to school. One day after school, I went to see him. but his parents told me he had been leaving the house every day, and they didn't know where he went. I knew where he was. I went to the secret base and found Steve standing in the clearing, staring blankly at the mounds of dirt. I walked over and softly called his name. He turned to me, his face streaked with tears. "I've been having nightmares," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll end up like Ryan. I come here every day to repent, hoping the animals will forgive me. I didn't do it, but I was still an accomplice." Before he could finish, his eyes widened, and he pointed at the mounds of dirt, screaming in terror, "Do you see that? They're crawling out." His voice was filled with despair and fear, as if he were witnessing something indescribably horrifying. I looked ahead, but saw nothing. Steve began screaming hysterically, then turned and ran deep into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, feeling a sudden icy wind blow past me as the light around me dimmed. I quickly left, but the fear stayed with me. In college, I heard Steve had been admitted to a mental hospital. His mind had completely shattered. And sometimes, I still dream of that day when Ryan killed the rabbit. In my dreams, the mounds of dirt always seem to shift, as if something is crawling out from beneath, waiting for its chance at revenge. A few months ago, I saw a parrot at a pet shop on the street. Not only could it speak human words, but it could also sing lullabies. It made me laugh so hard that I decided to buy it and bring it home. I named it Polly. When Polly first arrived at my house, it was relatively quiet. It would occasionally say everyday phrases like time to eat or time to sleep, and it would sing that lullaby. I thought it was adorable and spent a lot of time playing with it every day. However, as time went on, Polly started acting stranger and stranger. One day, I came home to find Polly repeating a phrase over and over in its cage, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." My heart sank, and I rushed over to see if it was hurt or sick. But Polly just stared at me with its shiny black eyes, continuing to repeat those words. I tried to distract it by feeding it and playing with it, but it kept repeating the phrase until I was exhausted and went to bed. From then on, Polly would occasionally say those words, sometimes during the day and sometimes late at night. Every time I heard it, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I started to think that Polly wasn't just an ordinary parrot. It seemed to be hiding some kind of secret. One night, I was woken up by a strange noise. Gradually, I opened my eyes and saw Polly flapping its wings in the cage, muttering something. I rubbed my eyes and listened closely, realizing it was saying, "Mom's here again. The little bird sings." My heart tightened. Why did it sound like it was crying? I instinctively looked around the room, but there was no one else there, yet the eerie feeling grew stronger. I quickly got up and walked over to Polly's cage to see what was wrong. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart raced, and I told myself it must be my imagination. Suddenly, Polly screamed, "Don't kill me." The sound was so piercing that I shivered. I quickly moved Polly's cage into my bedroom, shut the door, and tried to calm myself down. But the words kept echoing in my mind, making it impossible to sleep. The next day, I decided to ask a friend for help. I brought Polly to my friend's house and told him everything that had been happening. After listening, my friend stayed silent for a while, then asked, "Have you ever thought that Polly might not be an ordinary parrot?" I was stunned. He continued, "I've heard that some parrots can sense things we can't, even see things we can't." This made me even more scared. My friend asked, "Where did Polly come from? Do you know who its previous owner was?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know. I just thought it was cute, so I bought it." My friend sighed and said, "Then you need to investigate. Maybe you'll find some clues." So, I decided to go back to the pet shop. I found the clerk who had sold me Polly and asked, "Do you remember where this parrot came from?" The clerk thought for a moment and said, "Oh, I remember, a woman brought it in. She said she didn't want to keep it anymore and asked if we could take it. I thought it was cute, so I agreed. I asked, what did the woman look like? The clerk replied, she was wearing a red dress and a hat. I couldn't see her face clearly. I remember she seemed in a hurry and didn't haggle over the price, a red dress. This reminded me of Polly's earlier words, Mom's here again. I quickly asked the clerk, do you have her contact information? The clerk shook his head. No, she didn't leave any. Disappointed. I left the pet shop, feeling more uneasy than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that Polly's previous owner was connected to these strange events. When I got home, I started searching online about parrots sensing supernatural phenomena. I found many people claiming that parrots could sense things beyond human perception, even see things we couldn't. I grew more terrified, unsure of what would happen next. Just then, Polly started repeating that phrase again, don't kill me, don't kill me. I rushed over to see if it was unwell, but Polly just stared at me with its eyes, repeating the words. Suddenly, I realized Polly might be warning me about something. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound, like someone singing. I sat up abruptly and listened closely. It was Polly singing the lullaby. But the sound sent a chill down my spine. I got up and walked over to Polly's cage to see what was wrong. Then, I saw a woman's figure standing next to Polly's cage. She was wearing a red dress, her long hair covering her face. I trembled in fear, wanting to scream for help, but no sound came out. The woman slowly approached me, her face covered in blood, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. I finally understood Polly's previous owner must have met a tragic end, and Polly was her messenger, here to convey her grievances. I knelt on the ground, apologizing repeatedly, hoping she would spare me. But the woman in red just stared at me, her eyes filled with endless sorrow and rage. Just as I thought she would disappear, she suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist. In that instant, my head felt like it was being pierced by countless needles, and my vision blurred with flashes of images: a worn-out road sign, a lonely house, a faded house number. The scene shifted, and I saw a child curled up in a corner, crying, while a man swung his fists, beating the child mercilessly. A cold-faced woman stood nearby, watching indifferently, occasionally joining in the abuse. I wanted to rush over and stop them, but I couldn't move, forced to watch helplessly. Just as I was about to break down, the images vanished. I woke up with a start, finding myself on the floor, drenched in cold sweat. The woman in red was gone, and Polly stood quietly in its cage. I gasped for air, but the road sign and house number were etched clearly in my mind. That road was actually near my house. The next morning, I decided to find that place. Following the clues from my memory, I searched along the streets and finally found the house in a secluded alley. The house number matched the one in my vision, and my heart raced, my palms sweating. I stood at the door, hesitating for a moment, then mustered the courage to knock. A cold-faced woman answered the door, and I realized she was the abusive woman from my dream. I had found the right place. She eyed me suspiciously and asked what I wanted. I made up an excuse, saying I was a community volunteer checking on residents. She reluctantly let me in. The house was messy and dirty, and I made small talk with her. Just then, I heard muffled crying from upstairs. The woman, seemingly oblivious, went to the kitchen to make coffee. I excused myself to use the bathroom and sneaked upstairs. Through a crack in a door, I saw the child curled up on a bed, tear-stained and covered in bruises. My heart ached, and I quickly took out my phone to secretly record the evidence. After leaving the house, I immediately called the police and reported everything I had seen. Soon, the police arrived, and the man and his current wife were arrested on the spot. The child was taken to the hospital for treatment. I spoke to the neighbors and learned that the man and his wife had been abusing the child for a long time. The child's biological mother had passed away years ago. That night, I returned home to find Polly standing quietly in its cage, no longer saying those strange words. I knew it had fulfilled its mission, and the soul of the woman in red had finally found peace. This incident happened 3 years ago, on a gloomy, rainy afternoon. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and was shocked to see my long-lost friend, Jack, standing outside. His appearance startled me, heavy dark circles under his eyes, a dazed expression, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes darted around as if he were on the verge of a breakdown. I quickly let him in and asked what was wrong. He sat down, his hands tightly clasped together, and asked in a trembling voice, "Can I keep my cat's ashes in my room?" This question left me utterly confused, and my mind raced with possibilities. How did he end up with a cat's ashes? Did he accidentally hit a stray cat? Or had something happened that I didn't know about? However, he didn't explain further, and instead muttered, "The box of ashes is already in my room." I frowned and pressed him, "Wait, why do you have a cat's ashes?" He seemed not to hear me and continued, "I light candles every day, put out cat food, and prepare some toys. Is that okay?" At this point, I noticed his demeanor becoming increasingly erratic. His eyes were unfocused, his speech quickened, and there was an inexplicable panic in his tone. I tried to calm him down and said loudly, "Jack, stop for a second." He was startled by my voice and froze for a few seconds before whispering, "I'm talking about my cat." Then, he nervously started biting his nails, his eyes darting around. "Why would you keep its ashes in your room? What's going on?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "Lately, whether it's day or night, there's always banging and crashing in the house. I can't sleep at night, and during the day, I hear things falling. But every time I check, nothing has fallen." I frowned. "Hasn't your family noticed anything strange?" He nodded. "They have. The house has been so unsettled that they called a priest to come and pray. He sprinkled holy water in every corner of the house and hung a cross at the entrance. He said there might be a restless spirit in the house, and that we needed to soothe it with faith." He continued, "After the priest left, the noises got louder. It used to only happen at night, but now it happens during the day too. There are all kinds of strange sounds like water bottles rubbing, plastic bags rustling, and doors being pushed open. Later, my parents called a medium to perform a ritual. The medium held a string of prayer beads, chanted softly in the rooms, and burned sage to let the smoke fill the house. But even after that, the house was still unsettled. After hearing Jack's story, I realized how serious the situation was, so I decided to ask a medium friend of mine to help. This medium was skilled in communicating with the spirit world. As soon as she arrived at his house, she lit several white candles, closed her eyes, and began to communicate with the other side. Before long, she opened her eyes and told us, "There is indeed the spirit of a cat here. It cannot rest because of resentment." I looked at Jack and asked, "How did this cat die? You'd better tell us the truth." He lowered his head, his voice barely audible. I killed it. I was in a bad mood that day and accidentally hit it." As soon as Jack finished speaking, his throat seemed to constrict, and he couldn't make a sound. His eyes widened, his pupils dilated, and his hands trembled as he clutched his throat, struggling to breathe. Within seconds, his body began to convulse violently. He fell backward, hitting the ground hard, his limbs twitching uncontrollably, and white foam bubbling from his mouth. I was frozen in shock for a second, before quickly pulling out my phone to call for an ambulance. Meanwhile, the medium stood up, her expression grave as she looked at Jack lying on the floor. She swiftly took out a string of obsidian prayer beads, clasped her hands together, and began chanting an ancient incantation. As she chanted, the air seemed to grow colder, and the candlelight flickered. She then took out a feather-shaped piece of sacred wood and gently waved it around Jack, as if dispelling some unseen presence. Before long, the sound of an ambulance siren pierced the night, and paramedics rushed into the house to provide emergency treatment for Jack. Once his condition stabilized slightly, they placed him on a stretcher. Just as he was being carried to the ambulance, he suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist, his voice weak as he said, "I'm so sorry. I really didn't mean to. Please help me." After Jack was discharged from the hospital, under the guidance of the medium, we held a simple farewell ceremony for the cat at Jack's house to help it rest in peace. Then, we buried the ashes in his backyard. Jack knelt on the ground, his hands trembling as he gently covered the urn with the last handful of soil. Tears streamed down his face as he kept muttering, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The next day, he called me, sobbing, and said he had dreamed of the cat rubbing against his feet. In the dream, he picked up the cat and kept apologizing to it. He said the cat didn't pull away, but instead gently nuzzled his face with its forehead, letting out a familiar purr. In that moment, he felt an unprecedented warmth and peace, as if the weight in his heart had finally been lifted. He cried, "I know it forgave me, but I'll never forgive myself." After that, he started participating in animal rescue activities, often volunteering at shelters to help stray cats and dogs. I think he truly repented from the heart,